is, why are the toes in Daniel chapter 2, which are represented as 10 divisions of Rome? Let me read the question as it's written. Why is the toes represented as the 10 divisions of Rome on the 1850 chart, which corrected the mistakes? So that's the question. So the toes of Daniel chapter 2, if you're familiar with the 1843 chart, they're represented as the 10 nations of Europe. And those figures are repeated on the 1850 chart. And I think the person's asking the question, well, if the 1850 chart is a corrected chart, why is that information still on the 1850 chart? So I'm going to try and paraphrase some Spirit of Prophecy quotes. I don't have them to hand either. But this is the reason. You'll find a lot of the information to this. So is that this one, or is it that one? Is it echoing? Yeah? It's echoing, Thomas. Okay. The response to that is this. Ellen White says that there was a single mistake on the 1843 chart, and this single mistake was to do in the figures. So she uses this term to do with the figures. So she uses a single mistake in the figures. And then when you see the context of the point that she's making, you know that the mistake is to do with the year 1843, where it should be 1844. If you look at the question, it says the 10 divisions of Rome on the 1850 chart, which corrected the mistakes. So there's no denying that there are a number of mistakes, both on the 1843 chart and on the 1850 chart. There are a number of mistakes. There's some typos. There's, I think on the 1843 chart, there's a Bible quote that's referenced incorrectly. But all those mistakes aren't dealt with.
What is the Bible that's incorrectly stated there, the Bible verse?
It's not, it's a minor verse. I think they quote Daniel 11:12, and it should be Daniel 12:12 or something like that. It's a very minor, obscure quote or a reference text on the 1843 chart. But the mistake that she deals with is the mistake that was of importance to God's church, to God's people, and it was the issue of the date. And she says there was a single mistake in the figures, and that single mistake was corrected on the 1850 chart. And that's really the only issue that she's dealing with respect to the mistakes that were on the chart. Some people get really tied up on the role of Spirit of Prophecy, and they expect her to point out and correct everything like an editor, if you like. So they expect her to go and proofread all the books that were written by all the pioneers and all the articles and everything that was done. And when she doesn't do that, and she'll recommend a book or saying this is good information, people take that as license that everything is exactly correct and there are no mistakes on that. And it's an erroneous position. I'm not talking about her writings as they stand as a body of work, the Testimonies, Conflict of the Ages series. But when she makes comments and recommendations on other people's work, we have to be careful on how we treat her statements. So, I don't know if the person who asked that question is here, if it answers that question. If they want to, does it answer that question? And there are a number of quotes on that. There's a lot of behind that issue of the mistake and the figures, and you will notice that there's one mistake in figures plural, and the figures are these representations or these calculations, and so there's a mistake on two calculations in the 1843 chart, and that mistake is corrected, single mistake, on 2 calculations in the 1850 chart. And the mistake is to do with the year 1843 to 1844. And the 2 mistakes, sorry, the 2 calculations that are incorrectly done on the 1843 chart is when they calculate from 677 BC and they add 2520 onto it, and they come to 1843. And the other mistake is when they go from 457 BC and they add 2300 days and they get to 1843. There's the single mistake, because the mistake is in this calculation. It's the same mistake, but it's in 2 figures, 1, 2. And both of those issues are addressed in the 1850 chart, which was the mistake that was of importance to the message that God's people delivered at that time. The other mistakes weren't dealt with. Ellen White was asked once if the pioneers were inspired by God, and her response to that is quite candid. She says, "I can't say that they were inspired in the sense of being prophets, but they were led by God." And whenever a human being does any work for God, they're always going to imprint their humanity onto that work, and they dirty that work for God. So the closer we are to Christ, the less we do of that work. And you'll see it in many instances. Even in the work of John the Baptist, when he goes to prison and there's this debate going on between him and his disciples, and it's at their behest really when he says, because they're pressing him, is this really the Messiah? And he begins to have doubts. So his testimony isn't as 100% sound as it really should have been, based upon the information that he had. So it's little examples like that where human beings can mar the work of God. Can you explain the history of pagan and papal Rome in Daniel 9, 26 and 27? If you remember, when we looked at Daniel chapter 9, I said that normally most people only go through the first half of verses 26 and 27. And they don't address the second 2 halves of those 2 verses. I'll go through the verses and explain the intricacies of them, but I won't be able to give the background of how you enter into that verse correctly. It's based upon a study that there's actually a DVD series that I've done, which is available at the back. Someone's going to make some announcement about that. But it's connected to the prophecy that Jesus gives in Matthew 24, Luke 21 and Mark 13. And Jesus uses this terminology. He says, I'll paraphrase again for the sake of time. He says, you need to go, if you want to understand the destruction of Jerusalem and all these events of history, he says, go back to the book of Daniel and read that and understand. So he directs you to go to the book of Daniel, and in the other language that he uses, he goes and directs you to go to the book of Revelation. So more specifically, he directs you to Daniel chapter 9. He doesn't give the verse, but from the context of the discussion, it takes you back to Daniel 9 and to Revelation chapter 11. And it's dealing with the treading down of God's people, both during the literal existence of Israel from AD 31 up to AD 70, and then beyond that into the papal reign. And we discussed that because it's actually Revelation 11 verse 2 and 9, 26 and 27. And we already dealt with Revelation 11 verse 2, I think it was on Friday, which is dealing with the treading down of the Gentiles. So let's quickly go through verse 26 and 27. We're in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. The first part of verse 26, it says, and after 60 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. So the point that I want to add on here, when it says and after 62 weeks, there should actually be an understanding that this actually should be saying, and sometime after. Sometime after the 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. And the reason why you need to understand that is because the 32 weeks I won't address that issue. A good connecting verse to this is Isaiah 53 verse 8. Isaiah 53 verse 8, which says, "He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people was he stricken." So the first part of 26 is really dealing with Christ and his death. I'll address this issue. I'll do it then. When it says sometime, the 62 weeks, the 62 weeks, actually takes you to AD 27. Okay, it takes you to AD 27, the 62 weeks. But we know that Christ actually is crucified in AD 31. So there should be this thought that it's sometime after the 62 weeks. It's not exactly at the end of the 62 weeks. And that issue is addressed in verse 27 at the beginning of that. At the beginning of verse 27, and we'll come to that in a second. So the next part of the verse says this, "And the end thereof shall be..." Sorry, I've missed this, I've skipped a bit. "Shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself?" The next part of the verse says, "And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary." So this second part of the verse, where it says the people of the prince shall come and destroy the city and the sanctuary, is talking about the city and the sanctuary, of course. And this is talking about literal Jerusalem. Literal Jerusalem in its destruction. And that occurs in AD 70 by pagan Rome. And that's what's discussed in its first context in when Jesus has that dialogue, when he says, "Not one stone will be left upon another." So the second part of the third part of the verse, so that's A, B, C, 26, says, "And the end thereof shall be with a flood." Okay, so it tells you that the beginning of the destruction upon God's people, okay, so God's people are being punished. So first it's being punished, the Messiah gets punished, then the city and the sanctuary get destroyed, and then it says the end thereof shall be with a flood. So the end of this punishment is going to be with a flood. So we're looking at this term flood, and this term flood takes us to Revelation chapter 12, verses 15 and 16, and we're familiar with that. It says, "And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth." So verses 15 and 16 talk about a serpent and a dragon casting water out of their mouths. Okay? Both a serpent and a dragon. So I'm not going to get into a discussion of Revelation 12 about why one says a serpent and one says a dragon. Okay? There is a reason for that. But most people are familiar, if you look at the context of those verses, it's dealing with the persecution of the 1260. It is the 1260 year persecution. And we know the power that does that is the papal power. So this is talking, that was AD 70. And so this is talking about 538 to 1798, and this is papal Rome. 538. Thank you. So it says this, the persecution is going to be coming upon Christ, but then, Christ is going to die for our sins, but then it moves on and it talks about the punishment that comes upon God's people. And the punishment comes in two phases. First of all, it's a literal punishment a punishment that comes upon literal Israel, or upon Jerusalem, and the time frame for that is AD 70 by pagan Rome, and then it says, so that was the beginning, and the